Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, who's an adult, and Ted Cruz, who behaved like a baby.
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump is angry. Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump speaks for Mr. Trump.
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump trying to paint Mr. Trump as a racist.
Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump. Please do everything you can do to help Mr. Trump.
Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump.
I continue to believe Mr. Trump will not be president.